Being a Christian theology major, I want to go through the Quran and point out the 50 things that to me pop out as seeming to be erroneous. Now, many times I might be giving the Quran a unfair judgment. So if you think that I'm being unfair to the Quran in a particular area, then in the comments below, please start your comment with the number of my argument. First, the Quran evolved. The Sanaa manuscript, discovered in the 1970s in Yemen, is significantly different from the current Quran as we know it today. Second, the miracle of Fatima. In 1917, the Blessed Virgin Mary appeared to some children in a town in Portugal called Fatima, or Fatima, and she identified herself as Our Lady of Fatima. Now, this was not Fatima in the Quran, but it was instead another Fatima who had fallen in love with a Christian soldier and converted to Christianity. Third, the Quran's version of salvation history is illogical because although it makes Muhammad the last and greatest prophet, yet it says that Jesus, in the end, will judge the world. Why not Muhammad? Fourth, the Quran makes Solomon, who was supposedly the most wise person in the world, do seemingly unwise things like threatening the Queen of Sheba for doing something as harmless as sending him a present. Or it also makes Solomon go to war against the kingdom of the ants. Perhaps this is a mistranslation of a particular word in the Quran, but that is, on the surface of it, what it sounds like. Fifth, the Quran is not self-sufficient as God's complete message to the world. The Quran instead relies on other religions' scriptures to fill in the details. Sixth, Islam tries to partially endorse those other scriptures that it relies upon, but not completely endorse it. Instead, Islam says that Satan threw some falsehood into it. However, this is not logical when we consider how many falsehoods there must be. Here we see in yellow the books whose central message is contradictory to a message in the Quran. Is it logical, first, that Satan would be able to slip in these many falsehoods? Second, why would God permit that many falsehoods to occur in these scriptures, but not to occur in the books of the Quran? This is the sixth objection. The Quran glibly denies the possibility of any error slipping into itself, and yet maintains that all this error slipped into the other scriptures which it relies upon and which it praises, calling these scriptures the book. So Islam is then put in the position of having to be an historical revisionist. Seventh, the divinity of Jesus. The Quran says that none but Allah has the right to be worshipped, and that Jesus was not God. But then it says that the gospel, which in so many places insists as its central theme that Jesus was God, it says that that gospel was sent down by God. Muslims will say that either many errors slipped in or that the gospel was a different version. But Bible scholars and historians know that the gospels are actually some of the best, most well-attested literature from ancient times that we have. There are very few disagreements in the manuscripts, and there are literally hundreds of manuscripts from the ancient world. We have no reason to think that there's any flaw in the gospel. In particular, the book of John in the gospel focuses on demonstrating the divinity of Jesus. If any Muslim would read the first chapter of the book of the Gospel of John, they would have a sense of all four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the New Testament as a whole, just by reading that first chapter. So, is it likely that the gospel which Muhammad praises is significantly different from this gospel, which insists on the divinity of Jesus? 8. The Quran calls itself the decider of what is right and wrong. This directly contradicts Judaism, which says that the Ten Commandments and no more are the ultimate decider of what is right and wrong. Christians also agree that the Ten Commandments are the bare minimum that God requires to enter heaven. The Quran, however, touches on some of these commandments and not others. For instance, the Quran says that lying is okay, whereas the eighth of the Ten Commandments says that lying is false. And you can read the list of commandments there in Deuteronomy 5:22. 9th, the Quran has a different theme of genealogy than the Jews do. The whole Old Testament, from Genesis all the way down to Zechariah, speaks of a single line, a single seed. Why? Because in the book of Genesis, God promised to Adam, after Adam sinned, that the seed of woman, or the seed of Eve, would someday crush the head of Satan. Therefore, Jews have always charted one particular line. Isaac, Abraham, Adam, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Judah, other kings like Hezekiah, all the way down through history. Now, Christians would say that this was because it was looking forward. It was not just looking forward, but it was gradually purifying this chosen line from the effects of original sin until someday there would be born a virgin who, as the seed of the woman, would give birth without the help of a man, but just by herself, through the power of God, would give birth to the Savior of the world, who is both God and man, Jesus Christ. That's why Christians say that there was a single line. But the Jews say that there was a single line that will someday bring the Messiah. This is different from Islam, which focuses not on a chosen line, but on a chosen family. So Islam says that both Ishmael and Isaac were holy. Unlike the Bible, which says that Isaac was good, but Ishmael was a wild ass of a man who would be a bad neighbor and fight against all his brothers, and all his brothers would fight against him. But in any case, it's a whole family that is chosen in the Quran, whereas it is a whole line in Judaism. So Judaism emphasizes very much, and for a long time in many chapters, that Isaac was chosen, but Ishmael was not. Isaac received the blessing, but Ishmael did not. Then Jacob received the blessing, even though he was the second son, even though Esau, who was the first son, did not. And so on and so forth throughout all of the Old Testament. So there's a different genealogical model. 10th, the Quran claims that it is the same religion that was given to Abraham, Moses, and Jesus. Really? In particular, why does the Quran overlook the whole law of Moses with all its regulations about how to sacrifice so as to remove particular sins? 11th, there is sloppiness when we compare the two sets of scriptures. Both the Bible and the Quran cannot both be true. In particular, there are discrepancies in the story of David and the sheep, Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, and Moses and the burning bush, and many others. 12th, the Quran takes Bible stories out of their context, always reducing the whole story to nothing other than a moral lesson about the necessity of obedience. For instance, Zechariah, who was the father of John the Baptist, the forerunner of the Lord, the messenger that came before Jesus. But his father, Zechariah, in the Quran becomes nothing but just a man who begged not to be childless. Similarly, Mary, who to Christians is the immaculate, sinless, ever virgin, mother of he who was God, and culmination of all of Jewish history, in the Quran becomes nothing but just a blessed woman. 13th, swearing. Muhammad swears by Allah, whereas Jesus says, do not swear by anything. Let instead your yes be yes and your no be no. Anything more than this, yes and no, is from the devil. 14th, the Quran has no storyline or plot. By contrast, the Bible's storyline is that of the process of salvation history, the gradual purifying of the Jews to finally love God, and also simultaneous purifying of their seed to escape the effects of original sin. Whereas the Quran has no order in the books and the stories and the messages. The Quran sounds like a laundry list. 15. The Quran does not seem divine or supernatural in its character. Now, the Quran denies this, saying that even mankind and jinn could not have invented a Quran such as this. But to the careful theologian reading between the lines, the Quran constantly betrays itself and gives itself away to be nothing more than natural reasoning, i.e., something that either a human or a demon could have come up with. 16th, the author of the Quran could have been an angel or a demon. Why? Because no leaps of faith are required in the Quran. In the Bible, this is different. As St. Augustine says, first believe it and then you will start to understand it. Connections will start to be made. You will see the deeper sense and the deeper message. But no such deeper sense, no such eyes of faith are required to understand the Quran. No future trust in future prophecies is required. Muhammad doesn't make prophecies about the future. And lastly, the Quran has no symbolism, no deeper symbolism. Rather, Muhammad says what he means and means what he says. Unlike the Bible, where birds mean one thing, the land means the Semites, the oceans mean the Gentiles, all the seething nations. There's much symbolism. In fact, the whole Bible is a movie in symbolic imagery. So, what does this result in? Well, ultimately it means that the Quran is not a great work, judging by the standards of ancient literature. Ancient literature loved this depth, loved symbolism, loved literary devices like chiasms and ABAB structures, and there were tons of Greek terms for flourishes and ways to put greater depth into a story. They were terms like zeugma and peristasis and histron proteron and golden line. All these literary terms that occurred throughout ancient literature to show that a work had been exhaustively and with great depth made. For instance, the Iliad or the Odyssey of Homer has zillions of these. None of that exists in the Quran. The Quran would not be a great work, judging by the Greeks or the Romans. And therefore, if there's nothing risked, there's nothing gained. If there's no greatness in it, then there's no joy in it, no epiphany, sudden realizations in it, no passion, no hardship, and then triumph. Consequently, Islam has no celebration of any of these things. It has no beautiful music, no epic stories, no sacramental ceremonies, no mysteries. 17. The Quran lacks historical detail. When Muhammad was asked about the 7 sleepers of Ephesus, Muhammad replied, "Don't worry, very few people know." By contrast, when Jesus was asked about details that had occurred in previous times, he always answered in detail. 18. Muhammad admits to changing verses and superseding one verse with another. 19. The Quran demonstrates excessive redundancy. Was not the 20th mentioning of the miracle of Ad, or the 24th mentioning of the miracle of Tamud and the she-camel, enough? that God or Muhammad needed to mention it again? Twentieth, the Quran has no order. You could mix up the episodes in it and put them in a different order and there would be no noticeable difference in it. But this cannot be said for the Bible. In the Bible, there is a chronological order from the beginning of humanity to the very end of humanity. And later parts depend on previous parts. 21. The Quran dwindles into a trickle. This is not like the Bible, in which the final book of the Bible, the book of Revelation, demonstrates the same threefold structure that occurred back in the first book of the Bible, the book of Genesis. We still see that threefold structure. That shows us that the Bible is unified and symmetric from front to back. This is not like the Quran, where the first surahs are very, very, very long, and then the last surah is very short. This could be a sign of the non-divineness of the Quran, because one possible reason for using this structure could be that if at some point whoever wrote the Quran decided that some further modification needed to be made, they could just add it in as one more surah at the end, so long as it was about the same size or a little shorter than the previous surahs. So this is called an asymptote in mathematics, where something approaches closer and closer and closer, but it never quite gets there, so you can always keep going down it. There's never a final completion. 22nd. Here's an instance of unusual repetition in the Quran. This is a very minor objection. 24th. I guess I skipped 23. The Quran uses heavy-duty theological terminology, Islamic monotheism. The Bible never says monotheism. The Bible only says one God as opposed to many gods. The reason the Bible does this is so that it could be understandable to all people, not just academics and educated people. So it is odd to use these literary and theological terms right in a work revealed by God to all of humanity. All right, next are theological issues. These are discrepancies between Islam's view of God and the Judeo-Christian view of God. Islam portrays God as simplistic, autocratic, and niggardly, which means not generous. Now, the Bible's God, however, is resourceful, creative, and merciful. In the Christian version, he even comes down to earth and gives his life for the salvation of humanity. However, in the Islamic Quran, God is absent, separate, up in the heavens, far away from humanity. And God shows no emotion and only threatens and then punishes people. 26. The Quran's lack of miracles. Jesus testified to himself and to his authenticity by performing many, many miracles. So also did many prophets in the Old Testament, like Elijah, like Samuel, like Daniel. But Muhammad, even when asked for miracles, as the Quran says he was, always refused. This is not a sign of divine favor or divine support. Whenever miracles are mentioned in the Quran, they are always instead pirated from other times and places, usually from other scriptures. 27. The miracles in the Quran only scare you. Remember Abraham, whom we saved but destroyed Sodom. Remember David, whom we saved but destroyed all of David's enemies. This is unlike the miracles in the Christian and Jewish scriptures, which are given to inspire confidence and faith and hope. 28. The voice of Islam is not the voice of God. Muhammad testifies to himself, claiming over and over that he is the true one. Jesus did not testify to himself, but says, "My Father testifies to me through my miracles." 29th. The scandal of the particular. Do you think that God really cares about Arabic as the only language that his revelation can come in? Or do you think he really cares about the Kaaba at a particular spot on earth? Or do you think he really cares about eating halal? In Judaism, things like this have meaning only as a guide to help you understand deeper religious theological truths. But in Islam, there are no deeper theological truths. Islam is merely just a law. And so, presumably, these things must be all important. Do you think that God really would build a Kaaba in the heavens based on a Kaaba in one particular spot on earth? Moral issues. Submission is not enough to go to heaven. If submission were enough, then God would have to give heaven to all those who submit. But elsewhere, Islam admits that God's grace is in his own power, and Islam has no power over that. So, that means that Muslims cannot have confidence that they will go to heaven. Of course, this verse was said to remind Christians and Jews that they do not have a monopoly on God's grace and that God can indeed give his grace to Muslims. But the flip side of it is that God can also withhold his grace from Muslims, even Muslims who do everything they can to submit. This is why Christians, and probably Jews too, have always held that grace is a free gift and cannot be merited. At least the first graces. Only when you have a relationship with God, a personal relationship, can you then have confidence that there will be more graces in the future. And how do you create this relationship? Judaism creates it with a contract or covenant that is explicitly entered into through ceremonies. Christianity also has a covenant that is explicitly entered into through ceremonies, or sacraments is what they are called in Christianity. 31. Islam has no concept of attractive grace. The Quran claims that it gives many graces, but this is not the understanding of grace in Christianity as a pull, as an inspiration. Consequently, Islam cultivates negative emotions like grudges against those who do not agree with you, whereas Christianity cultivates positive emotions like pity towards those who do not agree with you. 32nd, the Quran denies responsibility. This is a very serious issue from the point of view of morality. You did not kill, but Allah killed. You did not throw, but Allah threw. If that's the case, then how can any court convict a murderer? If the murderer did not murder, but Allah murdered, then there is no way that we can apply guilt to a person. Every murderer knows internally that he has guilt, and this is a natural thing. It is natural to realize that you have been the source of evil. Islam is then removing this natural, God-given element built into our nature that causes us to shy away from doing evil things. 33. Islam has no understanding of sacrifice as removing sin. In Islam, sacrifices are just pious ceremonies. But in the people of the book, in the Jews, sacrifice was to make atonement for violations of the law of Moses. So the law of Moses was how the Jews would categorize and keep track of kinds of sins. And when you committed a certain kind of sin, then you had to do a greater or a lesser sacrifice to get out from under it and have it forgiven by God. Because after all, God is infinitely good, and the goal is to please him and return into right relationship with him under the contract or covenant, not just to go away and assume that God won't care. However, Islam has no priesthood, no law, at least not a formal law, and therefore it does not keep track of sins and how to remove them. Therefore, how can Muslims be confident that their sins have actually been removed? How can they pass on mercy to others, knowing that God forgave them? Perhaps some Muslims who are scrupulous will fear that they are stuck in their sins forever. This goes back to the issue of submission not being enough to get to heaven. Whenever there's sacrifice and a set system for it, therefore there is also a priesthood. Islam lacks a priesthood. Therefore, Islam has a deficient view of a Messiah. Whole books of the Old Testament were looking forward to the future Messiah. For instance, Zechariah. 34. The Muslim moral system is oversimplistic, a straw man. A straw man is something that you can attack over and over, a scapegoat. Islam focuses on paganism over and over throughout the Quran. It seems as if paganism is the only source of evil in the world. Contrast this with the Bible, which says that there are 3 sources of evil. One in one's physical nature or body, one in one's animal nature or senses, and one in one's rational nature or mind. Physical on the bottom, animal in the middle, and rational on the top. But tell me this, just because you are better than paganism, does that make you good? Indeed, in the Quran, there is no concept of social sin, no concept of not doing enough or sins against charity. But there's not a concept of not loving enough. 35. One who flees in battle can be condemned to hell. How then is God most merciful? In Christianity, one is always permitted to do less or to do nothing. One is never obligated to do anything except one has pre-agreed in advance to do and given one's word to do. 36. In Christianity, humans have inherent rights and dignity just by being human, or in the case of Christianity, by their bodies being temples of the Holy Spirit. However, in Islam, there is no such concept of inherent dignity, and so you can do things like rape captives and slaves. 36. The Quran repeatedly claims that it contains manifest proofs, signs, and revelations, but it doesn't. 37. The Quran encourages warfare. This is unlike Christianity, where there is something called just war, and one can only go to war under certain circumstances. Islam does have certain circumstances too, under which one may go, but they are less. 38. The Quran is worldly minded, saying that those who give of their wealth are degrees higher than those who do not. This would be equivalent to the Christian concept of the buying and selling of grace, also known as simony. Jesus, however, said that those who are degrees higher are those who give in proportion to their ability, not those who just have more. So the woman who gave everything she had, 2 pennies, was higher in heaven than those rich who gave much of what they had. 39. There are few positive spiritual concepts in Islam. In Christianity, there's glorious freedom. Christians are called a fragrant aroma, a song to God. Islam, however, praises warfare and fighting against evil. Islam would then be like the Levites in the Old Testament, who slew those Jews who had violated the Jewish covenant. After the Levites slew those who had committed the sin, the Levites then, here in red, were servants of the priests, and they would assist in the sacrifices, but not actually do the sacrifices. In the same way, Islam is like the Levites, whereas Christianity is like the priests, where gifts and good things are offered to God, and good things are given back. 40. Muhammad's adultery. Supposedly, Muhammad took his adopted son Zayd's wife, even after sexual relations had been had. To this we answer the charge we once upon a time made against the Roman pagans. If those whom you set up for emulation do such awful things as this, then how can your religion make you anything else except awful? In fact, there are many sexual sins all throughout the Muslim world. 41. Other sexual sins. Raping captives. Marrying first cousins, also known as incest. This was a special privilege for Muhammad. Having adultery with unbelievers. Today, this has resulted in failure in Muslim countries. For instance, in Afghanistan, since there is polygamy and Muslim men can have multiple wives, young Muslim men cannot, because there are not enough women to go around. Therefore, young men are encouraged to turn to homosexuality, and indeed 50% of the men in Afghanistan practice homosexuality. This is a sign of how the Quran has failed to make people good. 42. Lying is okay in the Quran. If lying is okay, and God allows lying, then how can we ever believe God? How can we ever trust His credence, His truthfulness, if He can permit a lie? Because if He could, then He could lie in His scriptures. In Judaism, the 8th commandment says, "You shall not bear false witness. You shall not lie." 43. Muhammad made himself a dictator. If there is anything that goes against what God or the Prophet has said, then those who disagree should have no option in the matter. 44. Muhammad was corrupt in a way in that he accorded special privileges to himself. He was allowed to have adultery with other Muslim women, whoever would offer themselves to him. Second, he said that God told people not to annoy him after dinner, and he also said that God ordered that none of his wives would ever be allowed to marry again. This was not said for other Muslims. Muslims, though they did not have as many privileges as Muhammad, nevertheless also had privileges in relation to other non-believers. For instance, they could kill unbelievers or drive them out, simply because the unbelievers had sinned, whether or not the unbelievers had any sense of guilt in the matter. This is unlike Christianity, which says someone can only be convicted if their conscience convicts them, that is, if they know it's wrong first. 46. Islam permits and encourages divorce, and God will bless them both. In fact, it even prescribes that a man may push a woman out the door the day that she gives birth. He is not allowed to divorce her while she's pregnant, but that implies that he could push her out the door the day after she gives birth. 47. Homosexuality, or at least sexuality, depending which translation of the Quran you go with, is permitted in heaven. And I have made this one last because if you would go with certain interpretations, this would not be the case. Some say instead of hoary-eyed maidens or virgins, 72 hoary-eyed maidens and virgins. Some translation ways of interpreting it would say 72 grapes. Okay, these are glaring fallacies, logical errors. 48. Muhammad's mission. Was he the prophet of just the Arabs or the prophet for all mankind, all of history? In some places, especially early in the Quran, Muhammad justifies himself by saying that every race has a prophet such as I. But then later, he says that he's the greatest and the last. He can't have it both ways. 49. In the story of Adam and Eve in the Quran, God kibitzes with Satan. You can read all this for yourself, but the short of it is that God says something to Satan that is very unlikely. He speaks of resurrection happening someday, even before there would be a need for resurrection, because if there had been no sin, if Adam hadn't sinned, then he wouldn't have experienced death. Therefore, he wouldn't have needed resurrection. Therefore, for God to mention resurrection to Satan, let Satan know that, oh, Satan, you are going to be successful in causing Adam to sin. That either means that Adam had no free will, that he had no choice and was guaranteed to sin, or that he did have choice, but God was just giving Satan advanced knowledge that Satan would succeed, and indeed key knowledge. 50. These are anachronisms, or things mentioned before the point in time when they should have even existed. For instance, the Quran has Lot speaking to the members of Sodom of their actions of sodomy. Of course, sodomy hadn't been invented yet as a term and wouldn't be coined for many years. Now, I could be wrong about this because I do not know Arabic, and maybe there is some plausible word for which some translator supplied sodomy. But on the surface of it, it sounds like this is an anachronism. Similarly, Hud and the Queen of Sheba encouraged people to be Islamic and good Muslims. Of course, 1,500 years before Islam had even been invented. Is it likely then that such a term as Islam and Muslim would have been used by people such as Hud and the Queen of Sheba? Probably not. Same with monotheism. Solomon in the Quran supposedly uses the exact phrase that Muhammad loved to use, "In the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful." Is that likely that Muhammad was actually quoting Solomon? If he was, why doesn't Solomon use this in the Bible? Next up, Satan promises Adam a kingdom. Now, I don't see how Islam can get out of this one, because since there were only two people, Adam and Eve, there obviously was no concept of a kingdom, was there? Had Adam been taught about the future progeny of the human race and how it would someday form itself into kingdoms? So, this seems to me like a glaring anachronism, that Adam should even know what a kingdom would be. So all of these things make these stories sound very unlikely and not like they are divinely inspired. Lastly, objection 51. The Quran protests that devils could not possibly have created this Quran. Neither would it suit them if they did create it. But why wouldn't it? If Islam is in fact a false religion, then wouldn't it suit the devils, since the devils love falsehood? In fact, if Islam leads to making you a less good person rather than a good person, if perhaps it even leads many people to hell, then wouldn't it suit the devils? So this argument only makes sense to a person who has already accepted Islam. It wouldn't make sense to someone like me who is just approaching it with an open mind. Therefore, it's a case of circular reasoning, or the fallacy of begging the question, i.e. presuming in advance what you're trying to prove. And why couldn't devils produce it? This goes back to the objection earlier. Indeed, for Islam to even say this sounds like it is protesting too much, and it really knows that devils could have done this and it would suit them.